Some truths are not buried, they are painted over. It begins with a murder in a quiet artist's cottage, and a signature no one remembers signing. In the stillness of Greystone, a blind man sees too much, a niece knows too little, and Holmes walks the fine line between justice and mercy. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The clues are scattered like brushstrokes, some bold, some fading fast. Let's uncover what they were meant to conceal. It was one of those grim grey mornings peculiar to the November season, when the very smoke of London seems to cling lower to the streets, and the gaslight within does little to ward off the damp melancholy without. Holmes had not yet spoken since breakfast, having sunk into his habitual postprandial reverie, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed, as if in communion with some invisible thread of logic only he could perceive. I had taken up a slender volume of contemporary French essays in a futile attempt to occupy myself, when a sudden brisk knock disturbed the air of stillness that had settled over the rooms. Holmes did not stir, save for one eye sliding open. "Expecting someone, Watson?" he asked dryly. I was not, and thus I rose to admit our visitor. The figure that entered was that of a young woman, no longer in the flush of youth, yet not far removed from it, whose bearing spoke of some inner agitation insufficiently concealed beneath a thin veil of composure. She stepped hesitantly into the room, removing her gloves with jerking motions that betrayed her nervous state. A parcel, tightly bound in dark oilskin, was clutched in her arms with the tenacity of a drowning soul to driftwood. I ushered her gently to the chair nearest the hearth, where she sat with a stiffness that suggested she would have preferred to remain standing. "My name is Julia Ranscombe," she said at last, her voice steady but thin, as though it had been pressed through a sieve of tension. "I am an art restorer, freelance, though I have worked for some reputable names in the gallery circles. I've come because I am quite sure something is not as it should be." Holmes, still languidly reclining, offered her one of his rare, polite bows from the settee. "Then pray, Miss Ranscombe, begin with what you believe to be amiss. But before that, may I ask, what precisely do you bring with you, so carefully guarded?" She looked down at the parcel in her arms, as if reminded of its weight. "It is a painting, Mr. Holmes, or rather, something that calls itself one. I cannot say with certainty what it is, only that it has troubled me." Holmes opened both eyes now. "I had taken a commission at Greystone Cottage," Miss Ranscombe continued, her gaze flicking uneasily from Holmes. "Might be forgotten by the world, should its roof ever collapse." She paused to compose herself, then proceeded in a more level tone. "The occupant is a man by the name of Ambrose Flint, a painter of modest repute in the earlier part of the century, though he has not exhibited in over a decade. What makes Mr. Flint notable now is that he is, or so I was informed, entirely blind. Some affliction of the optic nerve following an injury abroad. He lives there in near seclusion, assisted only by a niece and an elderly maid." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet he paints still?" "That is the claim," she replied. "And not only paints, but sends the finished canvases to his former dealer, who continues to sell them, discreetly but lucratively. My task was to clean and preserve 3 pieces for potential buyers. Yet it was the 4th, an unfinished canvas, covered loosely with a linen drape in a corner of the studio, that caught my attention. It was unsigned, but unlike anything else in the house." Holmes leaned forward, the light catching the sharp plane of his cheek. "What made it unlike the others, Miss Ranscombe?" She did not answer at once. "It was the eyes," she said finally. "They looked back at me." Holmes made no comment, but I saw the faint rise of his brows. The style was more intimate than the others, Miss Ranscombe went on, her hands tightening around the parcel as though to still their trembling. It was a portrait, only head and shoulders, of a man I did not recognize. The skin was painted with extraordinary delicacy, yet it was the eyes that held me. There was something uncanny in their execution. Not only the accuracy of the shading or the moisture on the sclera, but something beneath, a suggestion of life, of observation. I know it sounds absurd.
Not at all, Holmes said quietly. You are not the first to be disturbed by a canvas.
It is a curious phenomenon, the power of fixed gaze captured in oils. And the blind man painted this. That is what I was told, she replied. Yet how could he? The detail was so exact, so vivid. I began to wonder whether it had been completed by someone else in the household, but when I inquired of the niece, she grew pale and evasive, as though I had touched on something that ought not be touched. Holmes extended his hand towards the fireplace. Might I examine the work for myself? Miss Ranscombe hesitated, then with reluctant fingers, she laid the oilskin bundle on the hearthrug and began to unwrap it. Beneath the layers of cloth and paper, there merged a canvas of medium size, framed but unsigned, its surface veiled still by a fine layer of muslin. Holmes rose and crossed to it, gently lifting the muslin and exposing the painting to the light. I rose too, though I confess it was not curiosity alone that moved me, but some darker compulsion bred of her earlier words. The portrait was indeed disturbing, not grotesque, not violent, but almost too lifelike. The sitter was a man of indeterminate age, gaunt in the cheeks and brow, with dark hollows beneath his eyes. Those same eyes, rendered with almost forensic precision, met mine with such force that I found myself involuntarily looking away. Holmes remained impassive. He examined the corners of the frame, the grain of the brushwork, and the layering of varnish, saying nothing for some time. "This has been retouched," he said at last. "Recently." And by a practiced hand, Miss Ranscombe nodded. That was my impression as well. The lower edges show signs of reworking, yet the paint is not cracked like the upper half. I suspect someone returned to it, perhaps even after the initial painter was finished. Holmes replaced the muslin carefully and resumed his seat. The firelight flickered in his eyes. "Miss Ranscombe," he said, "you were right to bring this to me. There is something about this canvas that extends beyond mere artistry. The brush speaks when the tongue will not. And if your suspicions are correct, if a man once known to be blind is somehow connected to this work, then we may find ourselves facing something most curious indeed." He paused, then offered a faint, unreadable smile. Blindness, after all, is not always darkness. And not all who see are honest in what they claim to witness. I looked at him sharply, but he had already turned back to the fire, eyes distant, lost in the unfolding web that only he could yet perceive. The following morning found us in a dog-cart rattling eastward through a corridor of bare-limbed elms and frost-dulled hedgerows, the wheels crunching over half-frozen puddles that reflected a pale and persistent ground mist clung to the hollows and spread over the moor like a shroud. Holmes sat with his collar turned high against the cold, his chin tucked into the folds of his Inverness cape, his gaze directed not outward but inward, as was often the case when the puzzle before him had begun to assume a pleasing shape. "I confess, Watson," he said at length, "there is something oddly discordant in Miss Ranscombe's account. A blind painter who continues to produce remarkably detailed portraits, and a niece who blanches when asked the simplest questions regarding his work. It is not the painting that disturbs me, but the silence that surrounds it. "Do you believe the man to be feigning blindness?" I asked. "Possibly, but whether the deception is his or hers remains to be seen." And with that, he fell once more into contemplative silence, just as the high roof of Greystone Cottage emerged from the mist. The cottage stood withdrawn from the lane, half consumed by bramble and ivy, its roof of slate discoloured with lichen, and its windows recessed like eyes sunk in a skull. We were met at the iron gate by a thin woman in a brown shawl, who introduced herself, without welcome, as Mrs. Oglethorpe, housekeeper to Mr. Flint. She regarded us with the wary attention of a dog who has seen too many strangers come and go with no good purpose. "You were expected," she said. "He's in the studio, if you'll follow me." She moved without haste along the stone path, her keys jangling faintly in her apron pocket. The house itself exhaled a breath of cold as the door opened. Not the damp, open chill of the outside air, but the sealed quiet of a place that rarely breathes. The entry hall was narrow, its wallpaper faded, its scent tinged faintly with varnish, turpentine, and something more organic, linseed perhaps, or the trace of old canvas. No sound came from above, nor from the sitting room. Only the soft tread of the housekeeper's shoes guided us deeper into that still and watching house. The door to the studio stood ajar, and as we entered, the change in atmosphere was immediate and striking. The air was warmer here, tinged with a richer, denser odour. Linseed, paint, aged wood and dusted canvas. The walls, high and unevenly lit by a tall north-facing window, were hung with paintings, mostly portraits, a few landscapes, and several unfinished works propped haphazardly against the skirting boards. Though the lighting was poor, the faces stared back at us with such precision that I found myself momentarily arrested by their realism. It was not merely technical mastery, though that was evident, but something in the eyes, a habitual intensity, as though each subject had been painted not merely from observation, but from a knowledge of their innermost thoughts. The effect was uncanny. "Curious," Holmes murmured, stepping close to one such portrait. A child with severe features and a turned mouth. Very curious indeed. The room bore every indication of active use. Brushes in a jar of cloudy turpentine, a palette still smudged with ochre and lampblack, and an easel in the centre of the room, facing away. And yet, the man who occupied it was known to be blind. A figure emerged from a curtained alcove near the hearth. Tall, thin, and straight-backed, dressed in a black velvet smoking coat that made his pallor more evident. His eyes were a cloudy grey, unseeing. Yet his gaze shifted with peculiar precision in our direction. He moved with the aid of a cane, though his steps were sure, almost habitual in the way he traversed the cluttered space without hesitation. "Mr. Holmes," he said, inclining his head with quiet dignity. "And Dr. Watson, I presume. Forgive me for not standing. I find courtesy in my case is often misinterpreted as affectation." Holmes bowed slightly. "Mr. Flint, it is good of you to receive us." Flint gestured to two chairs arranged beneath a portrait of a veiled woman. "You are here about the painting Miss Ranscombe brought you." "We are here," said Holmes, "about the hand that painted it." The corner of Flint's mouth curled faintly. "Yes, I suspected as much. I am blind, gentlemen. That is no fiction. The affliction came upon me 8 years ago, following a fever I contracted in Tangier. I was told it was optic neuritis. I have not seen light since." "And yet you paint still," Holmes said. "I paint from memory, from touch, from voice and form, and, if you will permit the indulgence, from that interior image which the mind refuses to surrender to the dark." Holmes offered no reply, though I inquiry.
He rotated it toward the dim light and stood in silent study. I rose to join him. The canvas displayed the head and shoulders of a woman. The brushwork smooth and deliberate, the palette subdued, but not lifeless. Her features were sharp, high cheekbones, a narrow mouth, hair pinned in an old-fashioned chignon. Yet it was the eyes that again commanded attention. Dark, elongated, with a reflective gleam so precisely rendered it might have been the work of a master in full possession of his sight. "I presume this work is yours, Mr. Flint?" Holmes asked, without turning. There was a pause. "It is mine in spirit, if not in hand," Flint replied at last. "It was begun years ago and never finished. My niece has kept it in the studio, though I do not know why." Holmes glanced at me sidelong, and I saw the first faint glimmer of that light which always preceded revelation. Not the answer itself, but the scent of its presence in the air. Holmes resumed his seat with the same deliberate economy of motion that Flint himself had demonstrated. After a pause, he asked, "Might we observe how you prepare your workspace?" Flint nodded once. "Of course." He stood and moved toward the palette table. His hands moved with practiced familiarity, gliding across the row of brushes, identifying them by length and weight. He named them as he touched them. Filbert, fan, rigger, and selected a long sable-tipped brush before laying it back down in the correct place. Then he ran his fingers across the dry paints, naming colours he could not see but knew by order. It was impressive. No, remarkable. And I found myself shamed by my earlier suspicion. Yet Holmes's attention had shifted. His gaze lingered not on the artist's fingers, but on a smear of colour upon the edge of the stool, and the misplaced placement of one brush lying crosswise in the jar. Its handle still tacky with residue. He said nothing, but when Flint turned once more toward us, Holmes was watching him with that peculiar blend of admiration and inquiry that I had come to recognize as the precursor to doubt. We took our leave not long after, with Flint declining to escort us beyond the door. Mrs. Oglethorpe reappeared without being summoned, as if drawn by instinct to the exact moment our departure would be required. As we stepped back into the chill air, Holmes paused at the garden gate and looked once more at the dark upper windows of the cottage. "Well, Watson," he said softly, "either we are dealing with a man of singular visual memory, or one who sees more than he admits." And with that, he lit a match against the stone wall, drew in a breath from his pipe, and walked on into the mist. It was well past midnight when the tranquillity of Greystone Cottage was torn by a sound that, even in sleep, pierced the veil of unconsciousness. I was stirred at once from my bed by a shrill, anguished cry that echoed from below. Sharp, brief, and human. Within moments I had thrown on my coat and met Holmes in the corridor, already half-dressed, his expression unreadable, save for the glint of urgency in his eyes. Without a word he descended the staircase with swift, noiseless steps, and I followed close behind. From the ground floor came the hurried rustle of feet. Mrs. Oglethorpe, pale as bone, emerged from the shadows near the scullery, a candle shaking in her hand. She pointed mutely toward the studio. "The door is locked," she whispered. "From the inside." Holmes tried the handle. It gave not an inch. He bent low and placed his ear to the panel. There was no movement within. No groan nor rustle. Only silence. Absolute and oppressive. "Watson," he said, "lend your shoulder. Quickly now." Together we drove our weight against the old door, and after the third blow, the lock splintered with a sound that seemed to crack open the night itself. The air within the studio was curiously still, and colder than it had any right to be. A draught slithered in from the window to the left, which now stood ajar by no more than an inch, just enough to draw the curtain inward in a soft, unnatural sway. The hearth had long since gone cold. Before us lay a man sprawled upon the parquet floor, his limbs contorted at an angle no natural rest would allow. His eyes, wide and glazed, stared upward at nothing, and his mouth hung open in a silent exhalation. Holmes was upon him in an instant, and with one glance he gave a terse pronouncement. Neck broken. Death was immediate. The body was that of a man of perhaps 50, neatly but not finely dressed. A frock coat of some age, trousers frayed at the hem, boots recently polished. A faint smear of pigment marked one cuff, and beneath the left hand, partially crushed beneath the corpse's weight, lay a small folded handkerchief with the embroidered initials E.T. Housekeeper, who now stood frozen in the doorway. Mrs. Oglethorpe shook her head, her lips drawn tight. "I have never seen him before." Holmes turned toward the easel and gave a low whistle. The painting that had occupied its place earlier that day now bore a gash from corner to corner, as though raked with a blade in fury or fear. The canvas, half slashed and curling from its stretcher, hung like a wounded thing, bleeding oil and dust onto the floorboards. A slow, deliberate tapping came from the hall, and a moment later Mr. Ambrose Flint entered the room, guided by his niece, who clung to his arm, with an expression of horror thinly veiled by resolve. He was wrapped in a heavy robe, and his unseeing eyes sought nothing, though his head tilted ever so slightly, in the direction of the ruined painting. "I heard the crash," he said in a hoarse whisper. "What has happened?" "There has been a death, Mr. Flint," Holmes replied gravely. "In your studio. A man lies murdered here, his identity as yet unknown." For a moment, no sound came from the painter. Then he exhaled slowly. "I heard nothing," he said. "No footfalls, no voice, only the wind beneath the eaves, and then silence once more." Holmes stepped closer to the artist and bent slightly, as if inspecting his features, though I knew it was not his face he studied. His gaze moved to Flint's hands, one of which gripped his cane, the other clutching his robe. "Watson," he said softly as I joined him. "Note the index finger on his left hand." There, beneath the nail, barely perceptible, was a smear of Prussian blue, fresh and unmistakable. And yet it was not the pigment alone that concerned Holmes, but something fainter still, the lingering trace of an unfamiliar odor in the air. Not oil, not turpentine, something sharper, almost metallic. Holmes now turned his attention to the far side of the room, where the tall studio window stood ajar by no more than an inch. The heavy curtains, caught in the draught, still trembled faintly, as though reluctant to surrender their last breath of motion. He approached the casement with deliberation, first examining the sill, then the latch, and lastly, the narrow ledge just beyond the glass. "This window," he murmured, "was opened, briefly, and then shut again, though not fully." He pressed lightly against the frame. "Yet the catch, you see, is still secure." The opening was forced only as far as the interior mechanism permitted, and no further. I joined him at the ledge. Outside, a fresh dusting of snow had accumulated on the lower edge of the sash. Undisturbed. There were no scratches on the glass, no mud or soot smeared from an intruding hand or shoulder. If one had exited or entered through it, they had left not the faintest trace. "Locked from within," I said quietly, "and yet the man lies dead by violence." Holmes gave no reply. His eyes drifted from the window to the ruined canvas, then to the door, splintered from our forced entry, and back again. "There is more than one way to confine a man," he said at last, "and not all of them require locks." While Holmes continued his circuit of the room with cat-like precision, I found myself drawn again to the ruined painting. The torn canvas still clung to its stretcher like wounded flesh, and I crouched to examine the fragments now curling at its edges. It had been slashed cleanly, once on the diagonal. The cut deliberate, not the result of some chaotic scuffle. It was a gesture of intention, not accident. And there, beneath the exposed layers of pigment, I observed something odd. The brushwork beneath the surface, where the paint had cracked and peeled at the corners, bore no resemblance to the style of the visible image. A series of faint lines, more angular and erratic, seemed to haunt the background, as though an earlier painting had been painted over hastily and without the care that normally accompanied restoration or revision. "Holmes," I said, "see here, beneath the slash. This is not the same hand." He knelt beside me, his expression sharpening. "Very good, Watson," he said, "and more telling than you know." Then, without another word, he rose and walked to the hearth. The grate was long cold, its ashes grey and clumped in quiet repose. Yet Holmes approached it with the care one might reserve for a scene of sacred import. He withdrew his pocket lens and, kneeling low, surveyed the area before the hearthrug with slow, surgical exactitude. Within moments he extended 2 fingers and lifted a small smear of dark ash from— "Certain?" I asked, crossing the room to join him. "Because he smokes only Bohemian curls, light, dry, and quick to burn, producing ash as soft and white as bleached linen. This," he held the smudge up to the light, "is richer in oils, slower burning, and black as pitch. A Havana, perhaps. More importantly, it was dropped recently." I was silent for a moment. Then someone else had stood here, perhaps shortly before the cry. "Precisely," said Holmes, his gaze now returning to the figure on the floor. "And unlike our unfortunate visitor, this second party has left no trace of his exit, at least not within." Holmes now turned his attention to the rear entrance, a narrow service door that led from the studio to the rear garden. He opened it with care, allowing the crisp night air to spill inward. I followed him out, wrapping my coat tightly against the wind. The snow had continued its gentle descent since the previous evening, blanketing the stone path and the frozen lawn in a thin but pristine cover. It took no more than a minute to observe what Holmes had already surmised. "There are only 2 sets of prints," I said. "Ours, leading from the gate to the front, and those of the housekeeper. Nothing else." No one approached from the rear. Holmes stood motionless, his hands behind his back, his eyes drifting across the landscape like a man listening to an instrument just beyond his hearing. Then he stepped lightly toward the hedge bordering the east wall and knelt once more. "Here," he said. I looked. At first I saw nothing. Then a faint impression, 1 footstep only, pressed into the shallow drift, half lost among the leaves. "1 step inward," Holmes said, "but none away. A visitor who arrives, but does not depart." He looked toward the darkened window of the studio, where the lamp still burned behind torn canvas and corpse. "A locked room, Watson, and a man who walked into it from the snow, and never walked out." The light of day had not yet fully conquered the sky when Holmes roused me from a troubled sleep. There had been no further disturbances in the night, but my thoughts were still shadowed by the grotesque scene we had witnessed in the studio. Holmes, however, was brisk and alert, his coat already buttoned to the throat and his boots laced with a soldier's precision. "The snow has ceased," he said, "and it is time we see what footprints were preserved." We were joined at the back entrance by a weary constable, recently summoned from the Chislehurst station. He wore the resigned expression of a man not unused to odd requests, but who had not expected, on so bitter a morning, to be led across a garden under orders from Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The grounds behind the house were untouched, save for a light frosting of new snow, glittering under the pale, cloud-strained sun. Holmes moved ahead of us, eyes lowered, his step careful, head bent to the earth as though listening for secrets in the frozen soil. whatever he hoped to find. It was not long before he halted and beckoned silently. There, between the hedge and the studio's rear window, was a clearly preserved trail. 2 sets of prints in the snow, not yet softened by thaw. Holmes knelt to examine them, producing a small measuring rod from the inner pocket of his greatcoat. The first set, he said, belonged to a man of average height, broad in the sole, with a slight outward turn to the left foot. They proceed directly from the garden gate to the studio window. And the second? I asked. They are nearly identical in dimension, but see here. He pointed to a space where the second trail diverged. These prints do not return. One man walked to the window, another followed. But only the first appears to have left. I stared at the marks, which ran parallel for some 20 paces before terminating beneath the high sill of the studio. The snow bore no signs of scuffle or disturbance. The window, as we had seen the night before, had been ajar, but not enough to admit a man, certainly not one of such stature. Holmes tapped his cane softly against the frozen sill. One man walks up to the glass, another arrives later, then nothing. He straightened slowly. A vanishing is not so rare as one supposes, Watson. Only its execution defines whether it is artifice or miracle. We followed the second trail away from the window, moving cautiously along its winding path through the garden. Holmes marked each step with care, pausing at times to measure the stride or inspect the surrounding soil, his brows drawn in quiet intensity. The prints continued unbroken for several yards, turning slightly toward a thicket of bare hawthorn and laurel. Then, as if dismissed by some unseen hand, branch was bent, no shrug disturbed, no mark, no drag, no indentation betrayed further passage. The prints had not been interrupted, they had simply stopped. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, his gaze scanning upward toward the treetops, as though some resolution might be written there. Then he stooped to brush aside a cluster of brittle leaves with the tip of his cane. Frozen solid beneath, he said softly. No softness, no compression, no one passed here after midnight. A faint wind stirred through the trees. In its sigh, I imagined the studio window watching us, blind, blassy, and silent. We had scarcely returned to the rear gate when a cab pulled up along the lane, its wheels muffled in the snow. From it stepped Inspector Tobias Gregson, whose narrow shoulders and long, gaunt face bore their customary look of skepticism and ill-slept pragmatism. "You've not wasted time, Mr. Holmes," he said, glancing toward the house. "Nor made it easy for my men. I've had to divert 2 constables from the Blackheath post to cordon off the premises." Holmes greeted him with his usual neutrality. "Have you brought identification?" Gregson nodded. "The man in the studio, name of Edward Tolliver, former art dealer, was convicted in 1989 for forging Provençal landscapes and passing them through the Rotterdam galleries. Served 3 years in Dartmoor, released last spring." "A forger," Holmes murmured. "Indeed, and a clever one too, by all accounts. Vanished off the map after his release, until now." Gregson opened his satchel and handed Holmes a slim dossier. "I'd wager your client knows more than she's said. Men like Tolliver don't visit blind painters in the night without a reason." Holmes took the file, but his gaze had drifted elsewhere. We turned to find Mr. Ambrose Flint standing at the edge of the path, one hand resting upon his niece's arm, the other holding his walking stick just above the snow. His expression, though sightless, was strangely composed, as though he had arrived at some internal resolution. "I heard voices," he said. "Is that Scotland Yard?" "Yes, Mr. Flint," Holmes replied. "Inspector Gregson has identified the victim." Flint's head tilted. "Edward Tolliver." There was no surprise in his voice, only a quiet weariness. Holmes said nothing. "I thought it might be," the blind man continued. "I remember that scent. Linseed and wet wool." He always wore cheap wool coats in the gallery rooms, even in summer. The smell clung to him. Gregson blinked. You smelled him? I have no eyes, Inspector, said Flint, but I am not deaf to memory. He turned slightly toward the window. That same linseed oil drifted under the sash, sometime after midnight. I did not sleep again. Holmes regarded him for a long moment, but said nothing. As we walked once more toward the house, the mist beginning to rise with the strengthening sun, I felt a question forming on my lips, one that I had restrained for hours. You don't believe Flint is truly blind, I said at last. Holmes did not immediately answer. His eyes were fixed on the frost-laced ivy along the upper story of the cottage, where a narrow drainpipe ran from roof to earth like a frozen cord. I believe, he said slowly, that some men possess faculties sharper than vision, and others, who lack sight, see more than those who claim it. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. The locked window, I pressed. The missing footsteps. If the killer never left, then he must still be in the painting, Holmes said softly, almost to himself. Or what lies beneath it? He fell silent again. The cottage loomed ahead, sullen and still, as though brooding on secrets it had held too long. As we neared the house, Holmes slowed, and I followed the angle of his gaze upward. At the window above the studio, a narrow, dust-filmed pane curtained in lace, stood Evelyn Flint. She was framed by the grey morning light, her face pale against the dimness of the room behind her. Her expression was unreadable, not grief, nor guilt, nor fear, only a calm inscrutability that sent a quiet chill along my spine. She did not move. She did not raise a hand nor step back. She simply watched. Holmes met her gaze without blinking. She has the eyes of a painter, he said. Then he turned from the window and stepped once more into the house. It was shortly after breakfast that Miss Julia Ranscombe requested a quiet word with Holmes. She had been pale all morning, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of cooling tea, her eyes distant and clouded by some unresolved anxiety. When Holmes received her in the study, I joined them, and she spoke hesitantly, as though her words might unearth something better left buried. There is something I omitted, she began. Not out of dishonesty, Mr. Holmes, but from a sense that it might not be relevant. Holmes inclined his head slightly. The most troublesome details, he said, are often those we are inclined to dismiss. Miss Ranscombe looked down. 2 nights before Mr. Tolliver was found, I overheard a quarrel, quite by accident. I had returned to retrieve a pair of gloves left in the sitting room. As I passed near the eastern corridor, I heard voices, raised, though quickly stifled. She hesitated. One was Evelyn Flint's. The other was a man's. I did not recognize it then, but it may well have been the same voice I heard from the studio the night of the murder. And what was the nature of the quarrel? Holmes asked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He called her a thief. She sounded afraid, Miss Ranscombe continued. Terribly so. I remember how her voice faltered. He was speaking rapidly, low and hard, as though cornering her with something she could not escape. I only caught fragments. Canvas, deception, galleries, and then one galleries, and then one phrase quite clearly. You'll pay for it, one way or another. Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes, meanwhile, closed his eyes as though the words were being fixed into some internal ledger. What happened next? He asked. I lingered a moment, but the voices fell to whispers. I returned to my room and did not see Evelyn again until the following morning, when she was pale and strained. She seemed to avoid my glance and said nothing of the quarrel. It unsettled me more than I wished to admit. Holmes nodded slightly. And yet you did not think it relevant. I was afraid, she admitted. Not for myself, but for her. There was a desperation in her manner, as though something dreadful had already begun and could not be stopped. Holmes rose. Then let us see what else may lie beneath the dust. We made a quiet tour of the lower rooms, Holmes moving with his usual feline grace, his eyes scanning not what was most prominent, but what was most neglected. The hallway near the stairwell bore a thin accumulation of dust across its skirting and corners, save for one peculiar interruption. At the far end, a tall oak cupboard stood against the wall, its upper surface cloaked in the same undisturbed grey as the others, but along the floor beneath, a half-moon arc had been drawn in the dust. It was faint, nearly imperceptible, but Holmes caught it at once. He knelt and ran a finger lightly along the space where the dust was disturbed. This has been moved, recently. There is nothing remarkable about a cupboard, I ventured. No, he replied, unless it has something to conceal. He pressed his fingers to the edge and shifted it gently. The weight of it suggested it had stood there for some years, and yet it moved more easily than expected. Behind it, a shadowed recess in the wall awaited us. Within the recess lay a long, narrow object wrapped in linen, propped carefully against the panelled wall. Holmes drew it forth with great care and placed it upon the nearest chair. The fabric, once clean, was now faintly stained, and from beneath its edge protruded the corner of a canvas frame. He peeled back the cloth, and the portrait emerged. It was a head and shoulders likeness of a man in his middle years. Dark-eyed, thin-lipped, with hollow cheeks and a curious tension about the mouth, as though caught between speech and silence. His gaze, though fixed forward, carried a disturbing intensity. There was something unnatural in the precision of the eyes, not merely skill but obsession. Holmes stepped back. I felt my stomach tighten, though I could not say why. The painting was unsigned, yet it bore a hand I had seen before, in the ruined canvas, in the haunted expressions that adorned Mr. Flint's studio. "Does it strike you," Holmes murmured, "that this man watches us?" I could not disagree. Holmes turned the portrait slightly, examining its edges, its stretcher, and the fine hairline of new varnish that glistened along the lower jaw. He said nothing for a moment, then motioned me forward. "Look carefully, Watson. Is this not the face we found lifeless on the studio floor?" I studied it again. The likeness was unmistakable. The same bony structure, the same flaring nostrils and deep-set eyes. Only here, the gaze retained its cruel animation, undimmed by death. Miss Ranscombe gasped audibly. "It's him. It's Edward Tolliver." "It's Edward Tolliver," Holmes nodded slowly. "It was painted recently. The pigments are not more than a fortnight cured." But the studio showed no sign of it. At a precise moment, a soft footfall announced Evelyn Flint in the doorway. She paused, her hands clasped before her, her composure curiously calm, until her gaze fell upon the painting in Holmes's hands. She froze. A flicker, no more than a heartbeat, crossed her face. It might have been alarm, or recognition, or the desperate calculation of how much had already been seen. Then, with remarkable control, she stepped forward. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice steady but cool. "In the wall behind the cupboard," Holmes replied evenly. "It is an impressive likeness." Her gaze lingered on the portrait. For a moment I thought she might break, but she recovered. "It is not mine," she said. "I've never seen it before." Holmes said nothing. She reached out, as though to touch the edge of the frame, then drew back. "It has no place in this house," she whispered. And then she turned and left us. her departure as silent as her entrance. Holmes returned the canvas to its wrapping with slow deliberation, his hands unusually gentle. For a time he said nothing. I stood nearby, uneased by the heavy silence that now settled over the room. "I have never liked portraits," I said at last. "No," Holmes replied quietly. "They ask more questions than they answer." He looked again at the eyes, dark, reflective, executed with such precision they seemed, in some spectral fashion, alive. "Sometimes," he murmured, "paint captures more than a mirror. A mirror shows what stands before it, but the brush remembers." I shivered, though the room was not cold. Holmes wrapped the canvas once more and leaned it against the wall. The silence in the hallway beyond remained unbroken, but I could not shake the feeling that we were being observed, not by man or maid, but by something still and watchful, trapped in oil and pigment, and quite incapable of forgetting. Holmes crouched again before the blackened hearth of Flint's studio, his fingers moving with the gentle precision of a man brushing dust from a fossil. I had long since learnt that when my friend lingered in silence, stooped in contemplation of the ordinary, some thread of logic was tightening in his mind. A faint draught moved the soot on the hearthstone, and Holmes reached behind the grate with a brass poker borrowed from the corner. Withdrawing it, he displayed a paintbrush, charred, brittle at the stem, but its bristles shockingly preserved in one aspect. They were stiffened into a clawed clump, stained a deep, unnatural red. He turned it in his gloved fingers. "Curious," he murmured. "An artist's tool, discarded not in disuse, but in haste." I leaned closer. The faintest whiff of linseed, mingled with something metallic, reached my nose, and I drew back instinctively. Surely that cannot be. "I make no claim yet, Watson. But note, this brush was thrust into the coals, not merely tossed aside. Someone wished it obliterated, yet hesitated. Look," he pointed to the margin of the grate, where a sliver of scorched wood had lodged. "Missed in the dark, perhaps. Or interrupted." He stood slowly, and there was an edge of calculation in his voice as he added, "Let us see what else the flames were asked to forget." Holmes requested my assistance in fetching a small vial from his valise, which he uncorked with a flick of his thumb. He daubed a tiny portion of the hardened bristles and observed the change in colour as the reagent met the dried substance. A deep maroon leached outward from the brush's tip, spreading with a deliberate slowness that made the silence in the room all the more oppressive. "Blood," he said softly. "Mixed with oil medium. Burnt linseed, likely. A painter's residue, but not from art." I stared at the brush anew, now less an instrument of creation than a relic of violence. Used after Tolliver's death, undoubtedly. The viscosity and coagulation indicate the brush met flesh within an hour of the bleeding. The act of painting was not innocent. If painting it was at all. But why hide it here? Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the cold grate. "Because blood is never neutral, Watson. It tells its own story, and in this case, someone attempted to silence it by fire." He tapped the bristles once against the hearth and slipped the brush into a long envelope. "We must now test another medium, one that cannot lie." That same afternoon, Holmes took it upon himself to stage an oddly elaborate arrangement within the studio. I had grown accustomed to his peculiar rituals, but this was of a quieter strangeness than usual. He adjusted the position of the easel ever so slightly off it. Flint entered. Holmes, in his most casual tone, asked if he might fetch a particular brush. The one with the ivory handle, just beside the lamp. The request, innocuous as it seemed, concealed a trap. Flint stepped forward, reached not for the ivory-handled brush that gleamed under the light,
but for one near his elbow, its darker handle camouflaged against the table's surface. A second request, equally mundane, involved reading aloud a label Holmes had deliberately turned to face away from the sitter's chair. Flint made no effort, simply remarking, "I'm afraid I cannot see it." When the man had gone, Holmes turned to me with the faintest nod. "Genuine," he said. "Blindness, unmannered, unaffected. That, Watson, is a man who sees nothing and hides nothing." There was a peculiar stillness in Holmes after Flint's departure. A contemplative pause I had learned to respect. He stood by the studio window, observing the long shadows fall across the garden path, his fingertips joined before his lips. "He has accepted the loss of his vision," Holmes murmured, "and done so with a grace I rarely witness in any man robbed of his vocation." "You believe him incapable of deceit?" I asked. "Not incapable. None of us are immune to that vice. But the senses, Watson, they do not lie in the same fashion as speech. His gestures, the instinctive angle of his head, the movement of his hand towards sound rather than light, none of these were rehearsed." Holmes turned from the window, his gaze resting a moment on the darkened hearth. "If he painted nothing, then someone else did, recently, and with purpose. That is the path we follow now." I heard the soft tick of the mantel clock and the first creak of boards overhead. "She is home," Holmes said quietly. And the calm in his voice now carried a sharpened edge. That night, we made no overt inquiry. Instead, Holmes led me by quiet footfall up the side staircase of the cottage to a narrow corridor where a door stood slightly ajar. From within issued the muted scent of linseed and turpentine, mingled with something less familiar, a faint herbal sharpness I could not name. Holmes motioned for stillness. Through the slender gap, we observed Evelyn Flint seated at a table, her sleeves rolled, her wrist bent delicately as she worked with deliberate care. Before her lay a palette, daubed in fresh pigments, ochre, ultramarine, lamp black, mixed in quantities too precise for mere idle blending. Her expression was unguarded in that moment. There was neither fear nor guilt upon her features, but something deeper, focus, perhaps tinged with sorrow. The shaded lamp cast a concentrated circle of light about her task, but the rest of the chamber receded into gloom. Holmes leaned slightly, watching her strokes. "She does not merely copy," he whispered. "She commands the canvas." We withdrew without sound. At the stairwell, Holmes paused, brow furrowed. "She is not hiding talent," he murmured. "She is hiding authorship." Certainly. Continuing seamlessly from where we left off, the following morning, under the excuse of inspecting the studio's ventilation, Holmes requested that several paintings from the cottage be brought into the rear parlour, where daylight fell evenly across the wall. Evelyn complied without suspicion, arranging them with a familiarity that suggested these works had long been under her care. Once she had left us, Holmes stepped forward, examining each canvas with the detachment of a surgeon probing tissue. He produced a jeweler's lens and leaned close to the lower corners, his gaze trailing the strokes and textures as though tracing fingerprints. "Observe, Watson," he said, directing me to two seemingly similar portraits. "Here, the treatment of the shadow at the collarbone, one executed in short, tight dabs, the other sweeping, fluid, expressive." I nodded, uncertain. Flint's public works display restraint, a control born of apprenticeship, but in these newer pieces, the brush betrays a different will, more daring, more instinctive. He moved to a third painting, a still life of winter apples, and here,
Pressure inconsistent with an aged man's hand. These are the fingers of someone younger, a second signature. Invisible in name, but not in touch. Holmes turned to me. There have been 2 painters in this house, Watson, not 1. Holmes returned, the last canvas to its hook, with a gentleness that belied the weight of what he had deduced. Miss Flint, he said, more to the room than to me, has been painting under her uncle's name for some time. Likely since the first signs of his affliction. Name upon a frame is still less saleable than a man's in this market. And perhaps Mr. Flint, faced with blindness and ruin, consented to the deception. And the murder? Holmes was silent for a long breath, then. That is the shadow behind the easel. Was it to preserve the illusion, or to silence one who threatened to expose it? He retrieved the charred paintbrush from his case and held it against the morning light. There is truth in every bristle, he murmured. But whether it speaks of guilt or sacrifice, of love or ambition, we have yet to learn. And with that, he turned toward the stairs. Come, Watson. The canvas is incomplete still. Twilight had begun its slow descent over Greystone Hollow, casting a dim lavender veil across the glass panes of Flint's shuttered studio. Holmes, having left me in conversation with Miss Ranscombe by the parlour hearth, returned alone to the place of violence. I followed discreetly some paces behind, yet remained at the threshold as he crossed the threshold, with a gait measured and soundless. He did not speak. His eyes flickered over the scene with the watchful gravity of a man reconstructing not memory, but motive. He moved neither quickly nor aimlessly, but with the same inward quietude I had observed at crime scenes past, when his intellect steeped itself not in objects, but in their relationships. He paused near the hearth, drawing in a breath through his nostrils, slight, deliberate. A turn toward the easel, a pause by the smeared palette knife left unattended. Then another turn, slow, toward the locked window at the far end. He halted once more near the footstool, where the unfortunate Mr. Tolliver had been found. The air, though still, bore the faintest trace of burnt oil, mingled now with cold smoke and turpentine. Holmes tilted his head, listening. Not for sounds, I thought, but for absences. And in that room filled with colour, what he heard was a silence artfully contrived. Holmes stood before the narrow window set high above the desk, his fingertips grazing the brass latch, which, though outwardly secure, gave the faintest wiggle. He eased it open by half an inch, then closed it again. A soft draught followed him, like a whisper.
"There," he said softly, though I was now just within earshot. "That current bears the signature of falsehood." He pointed, not at the window but towards the unused linseed oil tin beneath the sill. Its cap had been loosened just enough to release scent, but not to spill. "Linseed oil evaporates slowly unless heated," he murmured. "Its presence here, together with the open latch, forms an illusion, one of recent labour, as if the master had been at work late into the evening." I stepped closer, catching the bitter tang now apparent in the fading light. "Someone wanted the impression of life continued," Holmes said, "of a man still in control of his brush and will." He bent low, peering at the sill's dust line. Yet no hand rested here. No presence leaned forward as painters do. He straightened, his gaze sharpened. "The window lied, Watson." And so, I suspect, did the voice. We returned to the corridor together, and it was there Holmes stopped abruptly, his brows drawn as if listening not to present sounds, but to those echoed in recollection. "Miss Ranscombe's testimony," he said slowly, "was precise in its phrasing, She claimed to hear the master's voice, stern, forceful, quivering with wrath. But she did not see him. "That is correct," I replied, recalling the young woman's account. She said it must have been Flint, for she knew no other who spoke in such commanding tones. Holmes gave a quiet exhale, not of surprise but of confirmation. Miss Flint, too, possesses a strong voice when roused. And it would take little artifice to mimic a timbre she had grown up hearing, especially in darkness. Through a closed door, I stared at him. "You believe she impersonated her uncle?" Holmes gave a slight nod. The true Flint could no longer shout. His lungs, compromised by age and turpentine, could barely manage full breath. Yet the voice Miss Ranscombe described rose and fell with vigor. He turned towards the stairs. The quarrel Miss Ranscombe overheard was real, yes, but not between master and man. It was a daughter's theatre, staged to shield a secret, and without further word he ascended. The hallway was narrow and dim. The oil lamps turned low for evening. Miss Flint emerged from her room just as Holmes reached the landing. She froze, not in fear, but in calculation. "I wondered," he began, "whether I might trouble you for one more candor." She inclined her head, wariness flickering in her eyes. Holmes spoke evenly, without accusation. "You wore your uncle's coat the night Tolliver died. The smudged sleeve, the faint linseed scent. It matched the impression of the master at work. But it was not his brush nor voice present in the studio." She did not reply. "You are left-handed." Anxiously near the door were not his. Yet the greatcoat hung where it always did. That, Miss Flint, was misdirection. Still, she said nothing. Holmes stepped closer, his voice low. "He loved you. That much is evident in every effort he made to preserve the illusion. But the quarrel you staged for Miss Ranscombe's ears, and the invitation you extended to Mr. Tolliver that night, suggest desperation." Her hand trembled slightly. Holmes paused, and desperation, I have often found, is the cruelest painter of all. Evelyn's lips parted, and for the first time since our arrival, her composure gave way. Her hand came to her mouth, and she turned from us, her voice low, broken. "I did ask him to come," she whispered. "Tolliver. I thought I could reason with him. He had found out about the paintings, said he would expose us unless we paid him handsomely." She turned back, eyes brimming. "I thought if I could speak to him alone, appeal to his decency, but he laughed. He said my work was good enough to fetch coin, but never respect." She faltered. "I don't know what I said, or what he did. I pushed him away, I think, and he stumbled. There was a sound, something dull. When I looked, he wasn't moving." Holmes watched her, his face unreadable. "I didn't kill him," she said, trembling, "but I invited him into that room. I started it, and I knew what it looked like." She sank into the corridor chair, the weight of weeks pressing at once. Holmes knelt, not beside her, but near enough to hear the truth through tears. "And yet," he said, almost gently, "someone else arrived before the constables did. Someone who made a choice before morning." Her eyes widened, then closed. "When he found me," Evelyn said, voice soft as gauze, "I was still on the floor." She did not name her uncle. She did not need to. He walked in, slowly, the way he always did, hand on the wall. I thought he would cry out, but he didn't. Her eyes stared through the corridor as though seeing a shadow still present. He listened, to the stillness, to the scent, to my breathing. You touched the blood on the corner of the chair and nodded. Holmes did not speak. You said nothing, just took off his slippers and pulled his greatcoat from the peg. I watched him drag it across the floor, smudging the trail. Then he lit the stove, opened the window latch, smeared oil on the rag. She drew a breath that threatened to shatter. By morning, it looked like he had been working. She swallowed. He said, "Let them believe I did it,
A blind man can't be hanged twice, but your hands, they've only just begun to speak. Holmes stood. And so 2 crimes were born that night, one by accident, and one by design. Later, as we walked from the house into the gathering mist, I asked Holmes whether he believed her confession. He was silent for a long time. "She painted," he said at last, and he watched. But did he truly understand what he was shielding her from? Holmes tilted his head, half smiling. "My dear Watson, blindness sharpens many things, not least the perception of what must be done." We walked on. "In the end," he added, "she may not have struck the final blow, but she set the canvas, mixed the tones, chose the subject. Her uncle, in turn, signed the work. The lamps flickered across the lane. There are crimes," Holmes said quietly, "that need no jury, only love and silence to endure them." And as we returned to Baker Street that night, I could not shake the image of a man who had once been a painter, now painting only in shadows, so that the colours of another might survive. The dawn was not a new beginning, but rather the muted echo of a night that had spoken too much in silence. We took tea in the frigid sitting room of Greystone Cottage, the hearth long since reduced to ash, and no one dared disturb the fragile hush that hung over us like the mist outside. Holmes sat opposite me, pale and still, his fingers lightly clasped about the delicate porcelain of his cup. Though he did not drink, his gaze was vacant, as if turned inward, chasing some shadowed thought that resisted the light. I had questions, so many, but none could find voice in that air, thick with something I could not name. Not guilt, nor sorrow, but perhaps resignation. Footsteps creaked above us now and then, but no one descended. A clock ticked solemnly on the mantelpiece, a metronome marking the unravelling of something that could never be rewound. I found myself watching Holmes's profile, looking for signs, as though the face of my old friend might yield the answers he would not speak. Then he rose, without word or glance, and left the room with the stillness of a man walking through the aftermath of a storm. I found him at the narrow escritoire in the study, his back slightly bent, the nib of his pen gliding across a folded sheet with the economy of one who knew precisely what he meant to say and what must be left unsaid. The sun had breached the rim of the hills, casting a cold white glow through the lace curtains. It lit the pale curve of Holmes's wrist, the gleam of ink still drying on the paper. He blotted it carefully, sealed the envelope with wax, and addressed it to Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, in his most austere script. I ventured a query, but he raised a hand, palm outward, not brusquely, but with a quiet finality that made further questions superfluous. Then, placing the letter in my hand, he murmured, "At midday, not before." That was all. No context, no names, no justification. I slipped the envelope into the inner pocket of my coat and felt its weight against my chest like a ciphered truth. He did not look at me as I departed the room, nor did I ask what he meant. Some silences carry their own instructions. It was nearer to 8 o'clock when Evelyn Ranscombe came down the stairs, a figure carved in restraint, neither hurried nor hesitant. The pale blue of her gown, now creased from a night spent uncomfortably, matched the tone of her expression, a composed emptiness that troubled me more than tears would have. She greeted neither of us directly, though she inclined her head slightly toward Holmes. He offered no words in reply, only a fractional nod that seemed at once permission and pardon. Her hands remained clasped before her, unadorned save for a streak of varnish still lingering beneath one nail. And when she turned to go, I saw that she did not glance back. Only at the threshold did she pause. There, with one hand on the door and her face half turned toward the light, she seemed for an instant to flicker, to waver not in body, but in resolve. Then she stepped into the morning, and the latch clicked softly behind her. I could not fathom what lay behind Holmes's silence, nor why he let her leave unchallenged. Yet there was in her bearing something noble in its devastation. It was not innocence, but it was not wholly guilt either. Mr. Flint remained behind. We found him in the drawing room, seated in his accustomed armchair, the fire now revived to a low burn. His fingers, knotted with age and regret, clutched a glass of sherry, though he had not touched it. Holmes stood beside the hearth, not addressing him, merely waiting, as though some unspoken agreement necessitated this parting exchange. "I suppose," Flint began, his voice as brittle as the logs crackling in the grate, "you know it all now." Holmes inclined his head, but said nothing. "I knew," the old man continued, "long before the first signature was forged." Evelyn thought herself discreet, but a man deprived of sight learns to read shifts in the air. The scent of linseed at odd hours, the varnish drying too quickly, silence in places where there should have been sound. "And Tolliver?" Holmes asked quietly. Flint's lips tightened. "He came to expose it. I heard him that evening. I heard her too, but I stayed in my room. Because love, Dr. Watson, has its own logic, and guilt, its own anatomy." I saw then, in the flicker of the firelight, not a man defeated, but one resolved. He would shoulder it, all of it. He raised the glass, held it before him, and said, "She painted." I watched. Let the world decide what that makes me. Holmes turned away from the flames, and without a word, we left the old man to his vigil. The path that led from Greystone Cottage was damp with the morning's dew, and our boots left ghostly impressions that vanished as the sun climbed higher. We walked in silence for some distance, Holmes's steps unhurried, his hands folded behind his back, his gaze seemingly unfixed on any earthly point. It was not until we had passed the last dry stone wall and the village roofs came into view that he spoke. "Justice, Watson," he said softly, "has many forms, and not all wear the garments of the law." I glanced at him, uncertain. Would you have had her brought before a magistrate, to be paraded through courtrooms while the true rot remained unseen, scent of loam and pine? Holmes's eyes remained on the road ahead. By mid-afternoon, a telegram arrived at our lodgings in the village. It bore a terse message from Scotland Yard. "Arrest made. Housemaid. Evidence burned. Details to follow." I looked up from the note, startled. Holmes was polishing his pipe with deliberate care, his expression unreadable. "You informed them?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "I did," he replied. "A precaution. The forgery was not the only crime committed, but the housemaid. She removed and destroyed Tolliver's sketchbook the morning after the murder. I found traces of charred binding in the waste flue." "And you let her be arrested?" Holmes looked at me then, not sharply, but with a coolness that chilled me more than any rebuke. "She will be questioned," he said. "She will confess." But she did not wield the palette knife. I felt unease settle into my chest. Why implicate her at all? Holmes struck a match, lit his pipe, and replied with the smallest sigh. "Because some truths are too delicate to bear sunlight, Watson. And because the truth, unguarded, can destroy more than it heals." The train to London hummed beneath us. a steady rhythm that mimicked the unresolved cadence of my thoughts. Holmes sat across from me, half shrouded in the reflection of the window pane, his profile framed by the rush of countryside blurring past. I longed to question him about Evelyn, Flint, the housemaid, and the peculiar architecture of mercy he had erected around them all. But his face was remote, and something in his manner warned me that introspection had taken the reins. He spoke at last, not looking at me, but at his own reflection in the glass. "It is not sight that gives us vision, Watson," he said, his voice quiet but firm, but conscience. I watched the landscape streak past behind him. Fields, woods, church spires receding into haze, and I wondered how many truths rode these rails, buried under silence and guided by those few who dared see with something more than eyes. Holmes turned from the window then, folded his hands upon his lap, and closed his eyes. The case was ended, but, like many that had come before, it did not leave us with answers, only questions dressed in shadows. The train rattled steadily toward London, the grey countryside rolling past in blurred silence. Holmes had not spoken for some time, his gaze fixed out the window, as if reading secrets in the drifting fog. Then, softly, he said, "It is not sight that gives us vision, Watson, but conscience. The law may chase shadows, but the soul knows the shape of its own guilt." I said nothing, struck by the weight of the morning's events. The blind painter, the quiet niece, the letter sent but never opened. All had played their parts in a truth far more tangled than any police report would record. Tell me this, do you believe Holmes was right to spare the niece from the law's reach? Or was mercy in this case merely a more elegant form of blindness? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you would have done in Holmes's place. And if this story kept you guessing, don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries of logic, silence, and shadow. Share it with a fellow lover of the enigmatic. And until next time, the game remains afoot.